In 78 Degrees of Wisdom, Rachel Pollack posits the Hanged Man as a notably odd card. The figure is not hanged by the neck, as we'd expect, but by the ankle among leaves, and looks completely unbothered. She draws connections to St. Peter of the Christian tradition being crucified upside down, and to Norse mythology where Odin is hung upside down from the World Tree, as well as to European alchemists, who all hang upside down in the same way, not in punishment, but for enlightenment. In A Wicked Pack of Cards by Ronald Decker, Thierry Depoli, and Michael Dummett, the authors, when faced with the peculiarity of the Hanged Man, simply claimed that it would have been self-evident to its 15th century players as the corpse of a traitor of the state hung by the ankle, as were those of Mussolini and his mistress in Milan after the fall of the fascist regime. According to Wikipedia, this mode of hanging had been used in northern Italy since medieval times to stress the infamy of the hanged. Which is more likely to be true? And when I'm handling the card, which informs my interpretation? I aim to play games with tarot cards, build scaffolds of meaning with them, really mine their imagery, symbolism, and potency for everything they're worth at the table, so I ought to know what I'm working with. Where did tarot originate? How old is it actually? Why is the Rider-Waite tarot so dominant among oracle decks? And, most importantly, how inextricable is tarot's connection to the occult? When I pick up a card, am I toying with forces beyond my reckoning? This is Playing the Popess, Part 3 of a series on tarot in role-playing games. I'm interested in the literal history of tarot, of course, but as a game designer I'll also be picking out any game history, rules, or similar structures for reference and posterity. Full disclosure, I took 2 semesters of French in high school, and I'm approaching these names and titles with that degree of confidence in my pronunciation. So, apologies in advance. Tarot descends from the Italian game tarocchi, which was once called Trionfi, or Game of Triumphs. According to Trionfi.com, the name Trionfi was born out of a ritual called Io Trionpe, used at festivities at the Epiphany of a god. In ancient Rome, a Trionfi was a parade through the city after a victory in which at least 5,000 men were killed. Boccaccio's Amorosa Visione is a poem that describes a procession of triumphs, each conquering the one before, in the sequence of wisdom, earthly glory, wealth, love, and all-destroying fortune, and her servant death. Another poet called Petrarch expanded on this idea with his I Trionfi, inspired by his unrequited love for the possibly fictitious Laura. Love conquers man, chastity conquers love, death conquers chastity, fame conquers death, time conquers fame, eternity conquers time. Many scholars agree that this is the inspiration for what would become the order of trump cards in tarocchi many years later after playing cards reached Europe in 1365. This is not uncontested, however, and the exact crystallization of the tarot deck we recognize today is hard to pinpoint. In a blog post for the Met Museum, Tim Husband estimates that, because of the complicated nature of the game, it is likely that tarocchi had begun evolving earlier in the 15th century. Helen Farley, lecturer in Studies in Religion and Esotericism at the University of Queensland, writes in a tarot chapter for the Occult World that no invention first appears in a form that is final and complete. Instead, there are a number of false starts, incremental changes, revisions, and redesigns, and so it was with the invention of tarot. Farley describes a 1449 letter that mentions a tarot-like deck designed by Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan and illustrated by Michelino da Bisozzo. The deck was meant as a gift for Queen Isabella, but does not survive today. However, the letter and an instructive treatise about the deck written by the Duke's secretary still exist. Duke Visconti's biographer, Decembrio, describes the deck as comprising 16 celestial princes and barons with 4 kings. Though the 16 cards were sequential, as with the tarot deck, they were also distributed into 4 orders or suits, namely virtues, riches, virginities, and pleasures. This deck was very different to the deck that later became characterized as tarot, but it does seem to have represented an intermediate stage between regular playing cards and tarot. Though the 16 deities were not present as trumps in later tarot decks, Franco Protesi suggested that the coins corresponded with the order of riches, swords evolved into virtues, cups inspired pleasures, and batons became known as virginities. A tarot deck that does still survive, keep in mind these cards were paper or pasteboard and most saw regular use and abuse, was painted by an artist named Bonifacio Bembo for the Visconti family a year later in 1450. This deck resembles its modern descendant pretty closely. 4 suits of 14 cards each, and 22 trump cards, though all cards are at this point missing inscribed numbers and titles. The trump cards depict subjects that would have been in popular knowledge where Tteroki was played, including such figures as the Hanged Man, yes, but also the Pope and Popess, Fortitude, and Mountebank, which is either a medicine seller or a charlatan, or probably both. The suits were cups, swords, batons, and coins, which comes as no surprise to Husband, as that's what the suit symbols of Italian playing cards remain to this day. Between these and the Visconti Sforza deck, Farley claims that Duke Filippo Maria Visconti did in fact invent the tarot deck, asserting that the symbolism of the trumps connected to his own life. For example, the cards of the Emperor, Empress, Pope, and Popess represented spiritual and temporal power in northern Italy in late medieval and early modern times. Milan was caught in a power struggle between the Pope, exerting influence from Rome, and the Holy Roman Empire to the north. These 4 cards are indicative of that struggle. Interestingly, the Popess has been linked to the figure of Sister Maifrida da Pirovano, who was a relative of the Viscontis. She was a member of the heretical sect of the Guglielmites. Significantly, none of the extant decks possessed either the Devil Trump or the Tower Trump, standard in modern tarot decks. The Tower, or Torre in Italian, was also the name of the main political rivals of the Visconti in Milan. It is not inconceivable that the Tower card, with its destructive and violent imagery, was present in the original decks, symbolizing the eventual triumph of the Viscontis over the Della Torres. I guess if you've done enough research, you can get away with citing your older work. I'm not an academic. Farley's theory is interesting, but improbable. On his blog Pre-Ghibelline Tarot History, Michael J. Hurst recounts when Franco Pertesi posted on the Tarot History Forum and sparked some drama over a diary entry in 1440 by notary Giusto Giusti, which reads, "Friday, 16 September. I gave to the magnificent Lord Sir Gismondo a pack of triumph cards that I had made expressly in Florence, with his arms and beautifully done, which cost me 4.5 ducats. Pertesi had anticipated that this update to the historical record would spark some interest, but Hurst and apparently many others were not impressed. According to them, Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta was the first known tarot enthusiast, so gifting him a tarot deck is a no-brainer." Hurst writes, "The only thing special about the deck is the customization. It would make no sense to describe such a personalized tarot deck unless the game and deck were already established. That places a popular and standardized tarot deck 9 years before Duke Visconti's experiments." The search for tarot's true inventor is a fascinating rabbit hole, and I'll leave links to my sources in the description so you can take a peek if you like. But the point is, we know that the tarot deck was invented in Italy, and can place its invention alongside Tteroki roughly around 1410 to 1445. Decker, Depolis, and Domit write, "In the early 16th century, Tteroki spread to France and Switzerland, almost certainly in consequence of the wars in which the Swiss were involved, of the French to capture Milan. Tarot was known to French writers before the late 18th century solely as a game more widely played in France than chess. French card manufacturers picked up the game and ran with it, creating the Tarot de Marseille, which differs slightly from the Italian tarot deck. Nevertheless, the game at hand was still Tteroki. Tteroki is a trick-taking game, and is played more or less like this. The Fool, the World, and all kings are worth 5 points. Queens are 4, knights are 3, pages are 2, and every other card is worth 1 point. Some of the numbered or pip cards are removed from the deck. Each player gets around 15 cards to their hand. The goal of a round, or a trick, is to have the highest ranking card. If you have that, you get to collect all the cards played in the trick. Each player plays 1 card. The first player decides the suit, and the others either follow suit or play a trump card. Higher pips beat lower, trumps beat pips, higher trumps beat lower trumps. The Fool never wins a trick. At the end of the game, whoever collected the most points wins. The trump cards were not numbered for a long time. Players would need to memorize their order, which would have varied whether you were playing with the Tarot de Marseille or the original Italian deck. Trick-taking games, and playing cards themselves, originated in China and wandered over to Europe through India, Persia, and Egypt during the Mamluk Sultanate, and probably was also introduced in Spain through its occupation by the Moors. But trump cards are a European invention, first appearing in the German Karnwürfel in 1426 among the peasantry. This was probably independent of tarot, since the trump wasn't called a trump in Karnwürfel, but instead the chosen suit. Having unique picture cards for the trumps is a quirk of Tteroki. We know that the cards traveled west across the continent. Could they have come with Romani travelers? After all, we know that the Roma originated in India. Well, no, the dates don't match up. The Roma first appeared in Western Europe in 1417, reaching Italy in 1422 and France in 1427. That dates them early enough to beat tarot cards in 1440, but not playing cards, which appeared in Catalonia by 1370. Also, there's no evidence that tarot was present in India before the 19th century. There's plenty of evidence of playing cards in India, though, such as Ganjifa cards in 1527. Notably, Ganjifa decks vary widely in how many suits they contain. Mamluk Ganjifa consists of 52 cards, divided into the 4 suits of coins, polo sticks, cups, and swords, from which the Italian suits naturally descend. But Dashavatara Ganjifa is 120 cards with 10 suits, which correspond to the 10 avatars of Vishnu. The Ramayan Ganjifa is comprised of 8 or 10 suits, with the numeral cards depicting episodes from the epic Ramayana, each suit providing a different story. However, again, no evidence points to the existence of trump cards in Ganjifa decks, nor to the use of them as divination tools in India. Even when Ramani travelers carried decks with them, it was for playing card games. Their preferred method of divination up until the 17th century was palmistry. This is reinforced by a wide variety of sources, from sympathetic to outright hostile. All of this isn't to say that there was no other usage of tarot decks in Renaissance Europe. One early recorded use of the deck I would now qualify as a game was a minor verse form known as ttrpg appropriati. The poet selected 22 people of some group, the ladies at a court for instance, and assigned one of the trumps, including the fool, to each of them, quote, describing each of them in turn in a verse where the name of the trump card assigned to her figured prominently, end quote. But according to Decker, de Police, and Dummett, no esoteric symbolism was applied, just the surface meaning of the trump cards. Similar tag-yourself-style society games were played without cards or poets, just groups of 22 assigning each other as trumps. There is even a description of a, quote, non-standard tarot game, one played with a non-standard pack having a verse tercet on each card. Each player had to read out the verses on his cards, from which much amusement was supposed to derive, end quote. A verse tercet on a non-standard tarot card. What a funny idea. The authors do not claim that these games were designed to survive the test of time, though imagining any of these games as so fun as to write them down for posterity feels like a stretch. But hey, I'm not a scholar of 15th century society games. Maybe the joke was funnier back then. It does remind me of the verses written down on Loteria cards, which similarly carry images meant to speak to popular archetypes of the time that they were designed. Though Loteria cards aren't played on their own, they're called out to a group of players in conjunction with Loteria boards, which are a lot like bingo boards. Interestingly, Loteria was also invented in 15th century Italy, and then was popularized in 19th century Mexico. But that's its own video. The deck with the most influence over the modern understanding of tarot is likely the Solabusca tarot. According to Wikipedia, Arthur Mager Hines supposed that the deck was engraved around 1490 and then hand-painted in 1491, created for a Venetian client by Mattia Cerati da Cosendola, a miniaturist operating in Ferrara, the center of tarot card production at the time. In 1907, the Busca Cerboloni family donated black and white photographs of all 78 cards to the British Museum. The Solabusca tarot is notable in that every card, including the pip or minor arcana cards, have images on them. It's very likely that A.E. Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith had both the opportunity and motive to take inspiration from them for the Rider-Waite tarot pack produced in 1909. More on that later. But the imagery of these tarot decks is very intentional, and very specific. Could it be that their artists drew some inspiration from the occult? Pollock implies this, but admits that there is no historical basis for it. A Wicked Pack of Cards concedes that the cards are heavily symbolic, since, quote, the Renaissance reveled in hidden symbolism, and the occult sciences enjoyed greater prestige in the Christian world than at any other time before or since, end quote. Whether that symbolism is esoteric, that is, intelligible only to those few trained in the occult, the three authors regard with skepticism. One of their arguments against it is an anonymous sermon recorded in the 1480s which denounces tarot with other dice and card games as an invention of the devil, but doesn't judge the sin as any deeper than gambling. The preacher would not have lost such an opportunity to reinforce his point. Farley offers the additional argument that during the Renaissance, it was widely believed that God embedded clues in nature that could be deciphered by anyone with sufficient knowledge. In this way, humans were able to discern the mind and will of God. Any form of divination or fortune-telling which made use of invocations, written petitions, or the use of sigils or signs was considered to be devilish, and could draw the unwelcome attentions of the Inquisition. If the symbolism was esoteric at the time, it must have been genuinely esoteric in the form of dog whistles that the public, including the Catholic Church at one of the heights of its power, either didn't recognize or didn't find offensive. Not to say that the Church never ran afoul of Tarot's patrons. Both Duke Visconti and Gismondo dealt with long, agonizing antagonism from its leadership. Gismondo in particular was canonized into hell while still alive, the first person ever to be canonized this way, then tried to kill the Pope with his own hands and died a few months later. But the disputes, as far as I can tell, were over rampant infidelity and possibly incest, not playing cards. It is possible for Tarot's meanings to be well and truly hidden, or for there to be double entendres lost on the general public. But this was a very popular game that was played by soldiers and landed gentry alike, on whom that esoteric meaning, and whatever magical potency it carried, was lost in the pursuit of play. Why it settled at 22 trump cards is unknown to me, though much is made of this fact in occult studies, since there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The removal of the Fool leaves 21 cards neatly divisible into 3 sets of 7, both of which are fun, magic-y numbers. In his essay on cartomancy, the Comte de Maillet tracks the development of mankind by dividing the major arcana into the Golden Age, characterized by youth, creation, and innocence, the Silver Age, marked by civilization, heroes, and strife, and the Iron Age, the modern age. Suffering is rampant, no one listens to their elders, everyone's on their phones, etc. But that's an interpretation that was made hundreds of years after the Trumps had solidified in imagery, order, and quantity. The word cartomancy, by the way, originates as cartonomancy by Atteya in his 1770 publication, Atteya, or a way to entertain oneself with a pack of cards, though the casual pastime of card reading in Europe certainly predates him. More on Atteya and de Maillet later. Speaking of cartomancy, the earliest recording we have of reading fortunes and cards is in Bologna, with the Tarocco Bolognese tarot deck. It differs from the Tarot de Marseille and Italian tarot decks in some notable ways, having only 63 cards and replacing the Pope, Popess, Emperor, and Empress with Moors in 1725. Numbers were added to some of the trump cards, and the suit cards became double-headed, which most cartomancers object to since it reads the card of an upright and an inverse. Pertesi discovered a single loose manuscript sheet in the library of the University of Bologna that gives cartomantic interpretations of 35 Tarocco Bolognese cards. A Wicked Pack of Cards provides the following description of their meanings. The authors clarified that these interpretations do not derive from Atteya's, though they don't date this manuscript, annoyingly, so I don't know whether it was contemporary with him or not. Okay, that accounts for Tarot's first 250 years of written history, more or less. Why does that change in the 18th century with the occultists? What about the Golden Dawn, and Waite himself, and Pamela Coleman Smith? Why does Tarot have such a stranglehold on divination and cartomancy when Lenormand is right there? The first published essay that describes tarot as an artifact of the occult was in the massive manuscript Le Monde Primitif by a French-Swiss Protestant pastor and Freemason by the name of Antoine Coeur de Gébelin. Gébelin first described tarot in 1778 in an etymological dictionary of the French language under the form tarot. The entry reads, "Game of cards well known in Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. It is an Egyptian game, as we shall demonstrate one day. Its name is composed of 2 Oriental words, tar and ra, or ro, which mean royal road." It doesn't, by the way. Oriental isn't a language, and the rosetic stone hadn't been deciphered yet. Gébelin had no idea what meant what in ancient Egyptian. In his essay, Gébelin explains how he came to understand that the cards were ancient Egyptian wisdom. A few years ago, we were invited to visit one of the ladies of our acquaintance. We found her occupied in playing this game with some other people. We play a game which you surely do not know. That may be. What is it? The game of tarot. In a quarter of an hour, the pack has been run through, explained, declared Egyptian. And since this is in no way the product of our imagination, but the effect of the deliberate and perceptible connections of this pack with everything that is known of Egyptian ideas, we promised ourselves one day to make it known to the public. So he saw a deck of cards and decided they were ancient Egyptian wisdom on the basis of... he decided it. A Wicked Pack of Cards concedes that it is true that Italian and Spanish playing cards were derived from Egypt, but of the 11th century, post-Christianity, and not remotely into Egypt's long ancient history. Just a reminder, in case there was any question of whether Gébelin was speaking out of his ass. However, he was far from the only Frenchman possessed by Egyptomania. The Comte de Maillet was an otherwise unremarkable court noble and military commander, not even a Freemason, but he wrote an apparently unrelated essay that utilized even more Orientalism with even less evidence. The essay agrees that the deck is a book, but calls it Le Livre de Thoth, or the Book of Thoth, and claims that the word tarot is from the ancient Egyptian tarosh. Again, Rosetta Stone won't be discovered for another 26 years, completely making it up. His essay also contains the first allusion to a Kabbalan connection and makes the 22-card, 22-letter association with Hebrew. De Maillet also includes the banger sentence, "There is, finally, a 22nd card without number and without power, which, however, increases the value of that which precedes it. It is the zero of magic computations. It is called madness." De Maillet's essay has a lot in common with Gebelin's, and though it differs in some ways, most notably, it does not address Gebelin's essay at all. A Wicked Pack of Cards presents three theories. 1. De Maillet was boldly and brazenly plagiarizing Gebelin. 2. De Maillet somehow came up with these ideas completely independently of Gebelin. Or 3. De Maillet and Gebelin drew from the same uncredited sources. Regardless, the three authors declared de Maillet's essay as the first publication to describe a method of divination with tarot cards. And what they describe is honestly bizarre. First, the trump cards and the suit cards are separated. Then, two people run through the decks simultaneously, card by card. The one with the suit cards turns them over while naming each card from ace, 2, 3, and so on, all the way up to king, and then back around to ace again. If a card they're holding is the card they're saying, that card gets added to the reading. The one with the trump cards is doing the same, but silently, paying attention to the suit cards, and puts a trump card aside whenever a suit card is chosen. They have fewer cards, so when they run out, they just pick up the stack and start again without shuffling. This seems like it would take a while, and no guidance is given for how to read the cards once they've been collected. But there you have it, the first documented randomization mechanic for tarot. Despite both the similarities and differences between his essay and de Maillet's, Gebelin published it in the 8th volume of Le Monde Primitif, and within 2 years it began to have an effect on France. Eteia was the pseudonym of Jean-Baptiste Alliette, a French seed merchant turned print seller who took Gebelin and de Maillet's theories and put them to work commercially, selling books, cards, and oracle readings to the general public to some success. His own manuscript, Eteia, or A Way to Entertain Oneself with a Pack of Cards, which preceded Gebelin's publication by 7 years, offers cartonomancy for idle pleasure, but Gebelin's proposal that tarot might be for deeper, more arcane purposes encouraged Eteia to elevate his pitch with his next work. Eteia can be credited with the first publication of card spreads, that is, arranging cards on a table with meanings given to each placement, as well as the first definitions for specific upright and reversed meanings, and the first specialized deck of divination cards specifically designed for occult purposes. Eteia wrote several manuscripts on tarot reading and formed two groups to continue discussing tarot interpretations, Société des Interprètes du Livre de Thoth in 1786, and Nouvelle École de Magie, or New School of Magic, in 1790. He would die a year later, in 1791. For reference, the storming of the Bastille happened in 1789, and in 1793 Louis XVI would be executed in the French Revolution. Just to give some context and a backdrop to the early days of tarot as an occult tradition. So much of what we know and understand to be tarot and the mythos surrounding it begins with Eteia and his correspondence. However, though Eteia may be the first famed professional fortune teller, he's by no means the most famous. No, that title belongs to Madame Marie-Anne Lenormand. Self-proclaimed confidant of Empress Josephine, rubber of famous elbows and writer of many star-studded memoirs, Lenormand did not care to elevate the practice of cartomancy so much as to advertise her own clairvoyance. By 1804 there was no shortage of fortune-tellers in France, despite a law that punished people whose trade it is to guess and prognosticate or explain dreams. Lenormand's many biographies are interwoven with exaggeration, plagiarism, and outright fabrication. But there is a police document that reports crowds at Lenormand's, the famous card reader, in 1808. This is not the only police record of her. She even spent a few stints in jail. Her 602-page book, Les Souvenirs Prophétiques d'une Sibylle, discusses in exhaustive detail her few days behind bars in 1809. Cartomancy is mentioned a couple of times in passing in this book, but never tarot itself. However, in 1817 she published a book called Les Oracles de Bien, which, thrillingly, includes her card-reading method. A Wicked Pack of Cards describes. She clearly always uses a picket pack, i.e. a 32-card pack. She cuts 3 times and deals the cards in 8 piles. She then draws them and proceeds to read. Although she enumerates the cards she draws in her story, she does not trouble to give the meanings. Les Oracles Bien describes a wide variety of fortune-telling after this. Cartomancy is very low in Lenormand's bag of tricks. She says little about tarot in her many, many books about famous events and how she prophesied them. Her publication of Empress Josephine's memoir is judged, then as now, as entirely apocryphal. Lenormand is a massive figure whose history is a dizzying mix of elevated truth and barely concealed fiction, told by her admirers, her critics, and herself. But despite her towering shadow in life, she never took a pupil, and her prognostications of the far-flung future were only revealed post-mortem in an appropriately mysterious letter sent anonymously to one A. Gallus, with the pseudonymous Hortensius Flamel invited along to provide commentary. The prophecies hit about as often as they miss, and Flamel's input mostly props up one Madame Clement as Lenormand's successor. Following that commentary is a biography of Lenormand, which seems to be based on a letter sent to another publication earlier in the month. What's notable about this, why I bring it up at all, is that it includes some detail as to how she conducted her consultations. She began each consultation by asking the consultant for personal details, including his date of birth, the initial letters of his given name and birthplace, his favorite color, animal, and flower, and the animal he'd most disliked. Clement, who set up shop in Lenormand's apartment, though never reaches a fraction of her predecessor's esteem, writes a booklet titled The Bleeding Raven, or The Future Unveiled, in 1844, and describes the following cartomantic layout. First, 13 cards are exposed and read, then 19, and finally 21. The cards that have been read being each time returned to the pack, which is reshuffled before drawing the next set. The Lenormand deck itself has just about as much to do with Lenormand herself as Clement did, capitalizing on her notoriety to much greater success, but resembling little else about her life or card-reading practice. Lenormand herself used 32-card decks, but the Lenormand is based on a 52-card pack, with 2 cards for male or female consultants. The Lenormand decks were first published by the French card manufacturer Grimaud, who started selling them 2 years after Lenormand's death, followed in 1850 by the German publishing house of J.F. Augreif, whose cards are slightly differently arranged. At around the same time came Petit Lenormand decks, which were 36 very simple pictographic cards that actually originate from a German racing game called the Game of Hope, published around 1800 by J.P.J. Behling of Nuremberg. The rules of which are: the cards must be arranged to form a square of 6 by 6 in numerical order. 2 dice are used, and each player moves his man according to the throw of the dice up to the 36th card. As in many race games, there are lucky and unlucky cells. However, the last lines of the text state that with the same cards, one can also undertake an entertaining fortune-telling game. It is a very simple question and answer system, using only 32 cards arranged in 8 rows of 4. Speaking of spreads, L'Oracle's Parfait, or The Complete Oracle by Albert Dalby, may present the first documentation of at least a partial Celtic cross spread in 1802, describing a layout of 5 cards in the form of a cross. Though, according to Farley, the popularization of the Celtic cross spread as we understand it today by A.E. Waite wouldn't happen for roughly another century, although what exactly about it is Celtic, Waite does not explain. Grimaud's Lenormand pack preceded a bloom of oracle decks in France throughout the 19th century. Some decks had cards representing things like hope, journey, illness, which had clear meanings to them. And some of these decks, though not all, included a small image of the playing card it corresponded to. But most of them were at the very least inspired by Atea's tarot, like Madame Finet's 1800 Le Petit Oracle des Dames, or the Nouvelle Atea, or Petit Nécromancien, produced by Parisian publisher Robert in 1810. Grimaud published 2 cartomantic decks under the names Oracle Belline and Grand Tarot Belline. The Oracle is a 52-card deck of numbered cards without rank or suit sign named after Marcel Belline, who lived on the same street as a cartomancy of mild celebrity named Edmond Biaudot. Belline discovered his hand-drawn and inked decks and passed them along to Grimaud to put on the market. Why these aren't called Oracle Edmond? Well, Edmond himself advertised his services by first name alone and was described by Eliphas Levi as a tall, stout man dressed in black. In his book The Urn of Destiny, or The Future Unveiled, published in 1854, he describes his methods. Edmond makes use of the 12 houses of the zodiac. Having shuffled the cards and had the consultant cut them, he distributes them into 12 piles of 6 or 7 cards each. Each pile represents a house, and each house a range of subjects. The reading consists in examining each pile in turn and interpreting the cards in relation to the subjects governed by that house. The meanings of all 78 cards, upright or reversed, are then expounded. Proper tarot decks took 3 forms at this point. German tarot, which had the French suit signs, featured non-traditional animals for the trumps, and were used overwhelmingly for playing tarocchi in Germany and Central Europe. Italian tarot, which didn't necessarily mean decks produced in Italy, but that followed the traditional forms like the Tarot de Marseille, the Tarot de Besançon, and the Belgian tarot. And lastly, the Egyptian tarot, comprised of variations on Atea's deck and others like it, including the Princess Tarot, which was determined to look more the part. Production of the Princess Tarot was taken over by Charles Wattilio, whose firm, active from 1874 to 1908, specialized in board games and playing cards for children. I would love to know more about Wattilio, as this is the earliest I've ever seen a games publisher who did games and only games, as opposed to toy making or selling games alongside books or prints. It's wild to me that someone sat at a work desk trying to pull game mechanics out of a deck of cards in 1874, the same year Camille Saint-Saëns dropped the Danse Macabre, and the Impressionists had their first exhibition. I would be delighted to see what else besides the Princess Tarot Wattilio had in his catalogue. What follows in Atea's wake is, honestly, a lot of French cartomancers of various degrees of earnestness, skill, and coherence, publishing many books repeating many of the same things down to the same passages from Atea's original works. The art of fortune-telling with cards petered out from the potential magical form that Atea formed societies to discuss to an agreeable pastime for the ladies. Of which, to be clear, I would love documentation, because those are gamers playing games. But I have not had much luck finding any beyond Atea and his self-serious clade of nerds. I mean, educated men. For all the societies Atea formed, tarot reading would have remained a popular women's game, had Eliphas Lévy not taken up the mantle. Born Alphonse Louis Constant, Eliphas Lévy spent the first chapters of his life publishing poetry, radical socialist pamphlets, and religious effusions. Like Gébelin before him, he began a man of the cloth, studying to become a priest until 1836, and joining the Benedictine monastery of Solesmes in 1839. In 1852, he took the name Eliphas Lévy, an anagram of Alphonse Louis into Hebrew, and plunged into the world of the occult. Lévy was intensely focused on high magic, described by Richard Cavendish as an attempt to gain so consummate an understanding and mastery of oneself and the environment as to transcend all human limitations and become superhuman or divine. As such, he regarded low magic such as professional fortune-tellers with great contempt, and distanced himself as much as possible. Atea's work, as foundational as it is to tarot's existence as a divination tool, and as essential as it is to tarot's popularity, was always at its root about making a living as a fortune-teller. Lévy discarded this base origin. For him, the tarot was a source of magical symbolism whose historical value was paramount, and whose use as a divinatory tool was tertiary at best. For Atea personally, Lévy expressed contempt. Calling him the father of modern cartomancers, he mistakenly described him as a hairdresser or a barber, and judged his books, which with some justice he characterized as obscure, wearisome, and barbarous in style, to have degraded the ancient work discovered by Coeur de Gébelin into the domain of vulgar magic and fortune-telling by cards. His endowments, Lévy tells us, were insufficient for a magus and more than were needed for a skillful and accredited diviner of the vulgar order. Though on the threshold of discovering everything that is concealed in the tarot, Lévy tells us, Atea was destined to die at the gate of the sanctuary without ever penetrating beyond the veil. No wonder, then, that he succeeded in producing only a misconstrued and mutilated tarot. So, out with the Egyptian tarot, and all its descendants. Back to the Tarot de Marseille, the standard in France for the past 200 years. To replace the fount of mysticism left empty from the removal of Egyptomania, Lévy returns to the idea Gébelin glanced over, that the 22 trumps had a connection to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Lévy decided with the same academic rigor as Gébelin of thinking about it really hard, that tarot must have been linked with the introduction of the Kabbalah to the Christian public in 1486. Although, why a deck that was Jewish in origin would have featured the Pope and Popess, who was a kind of Catholic in-joke, is beyond me. Regardless, Lévy was convinced that the Kabbalah and the tarot were two halves of a whole, neither intelligible without the other. It's worth noting also that there is no record of Lévy studying with Jewish Kabbalists, instead electing to learn everything from books and their ensuing commentary. You could regard him as a kind of Hebrew weeaboo. A Hebweeaboo. A Hebrewboo. A Wicked Pack of Cards does not mince words when it dissects the associations Lévy makes between these two collections of meaning. It points out the incompatibilities and inexact edges that don't quite meet in Levy's smorgasbord. The particulars are a little too dense for this overview, but the broad stroke is that Levy's proposal relied on syncretism, that is, the assimilation of discrete traditions into one universal amalgam, in search of a unified archetypal humanity to return to. A Garden of Eden, or a shared language before the Tower of Babel, to cite stories a Catholic like Levy would be familiar with. Dekker, Depoli, and Dummett seem sympathetic to Levy's goals, even as they find his methods pitiful. He wanted to draw on the best of the past to build a unified civilization for the future. Given his stance as a Catholic reformer and syncretist, he probably felt no obligation to inquire into any primitive Kabbalah, but was more than happy to accept the easy and attractive versions that came to him already filtered through centuries of Christian appropriation. Levy adopted this Kabbalism because he believed that it could be the means of reconciling Christianity and Judaism. Thinking that it had once been a widespread faith, his vision of a future of political, social, and religious accord led him to hope that it could be revived and made universal. In spite of the fundamental mismatch of iconography and the deep wrongness of the graven image to the Jewish faith, tarot is thus bonded with Levy's Kabbalistic vision of magic, and it's from this definition that almost all modern Western occultism pulls the tarot as essential symbolism. Is there a word for someone who's too into Judaism and Kabbalah? It kind of is anti-Semitic, but in the same way that Egyptomania is racist. It's like having a parasocial relationship with a religion. Semitomania? Anyway. If Eliphas Levi sets the guidelines for occultism going forward, Paul Christian, his pupil and friend, means to fill in the blanks. Dekker, Depolis, and Dummett introduce Christian as a shameless liar, and perhaps one whose steadfast Catholicism, in contrast to Levy's continuous struggles with his faith, frames Christian's contributions to the occult sciences as less than genuine. Christian does give us the word arcana to refer to the tarot cards, and proposes the following basic meanings for the trumps. He also expands the net of meaning from Kabbalah to astrology, numerology, and Hermeticism in his books L'Homme Rouge des Tuileries and Histoire de la Magie. The Grand Tarot Boolean, originally penned and used by Edmond, uses numbering from L'Homme Rouge, indicating that Edmond must have made the deck after 1863. Christian devises and repeats often a completely bespoke astrological system in his work, which demanded great ingenuity for its construction and is tedious to read about unless the reader appreciates ingenious constructions. He also invents onomatomancy, which is performed by taking a sentence of 3 or 4 lines and making an anagram using all but a handful of letters, predicting the destiny of the subject, and reinforcing that destiny with a Latin verse starting each word with the unused or mute letters from the original sentence. The anagrammatic method of divination, ludicrous as a technique, likewise required dexterity of the crossword puzzle type for devising the many examples occurring in the book, which must have cost Christian a great deal of labor. And finally, he contributes fatidic circles to the occult sciences, which Dekker, Depoli, and Dummett judge at this point is a system as complex as it is broken. The author's note in parentheses that he refers us to yet another table charms me. Imagine if he'd been taken under the wing of a half-decent GM today. What a heartbreaker he'd design. Eliphas Levi and Paul Christian's work would not bear fruit until a full decade after Levy's death. Then, in 1880, there was an explosion of secret societies in Europe, many of which drew their arcane understanding of tarot from Levi and Christian directly. In 1889, Stanislas de Guaita, founder of the Kabbalistic order and dubbed by journalists the Sombre Marquis, sponsored hypnotism healer and amateur artist Oswald Wirth in creating a tarot deck consisting only of the 22 major arcana under the title Les 22 Arcanes du Tarot Kabbalistique. Only 350 copies were made, and the tarot's iconography was gently modified to include more recently solidified occultist ideas. Wirth took another stab at designing these cards with de Guaita's approval, but these were not published until 30 years after de Guaita's death under the title The Tarot of the Medieval Artists. Later in 1889, Wirth contributed an essay on the astronomical tarot to the book Le Tarot des Bohemiens, elaborating on Christian's tarot astrology connection, claiming that tarot, considered as a whole, is preeminently the sacred book of occult initiation, and concluding by associating each of the major arcana with constellations in and outside of the zodiac. Wirth also wrote Introduction to the Study of the Tarot in 1931. His disciple, Paul Marteau, who was until 1963 head of the card-making firm Grimaud, how's that for networking, had a Tarot de Marseille pack reissued by the firm in 1930 with full intention that it be used for cartomantic purposes. It was Marteau who ended up giving the deck the name Tarot de Marseille, and expounded on the symbolism of each card in his book by the same name in 1949. Let's jump back to 1889 for a second, because we can't talk about comprehensive books on tarot without mentioning Popess's Le Tarot des Bohémiens, in which Worth's essay was published. In it, Popess, originator and leader of several secret societies in France and known outside the occult as the physician Gerard Encausse, makes an effort to document everyone who had written about the tarot up until this point, including those named in this video among others. He also... Look, numbers and I are not friends. I went to art school for a reason. So I find numerology to be perplexing at best. But Popess thought it was definitively important to combine a numerological system with the tarot deck. Decker, DePoli, and Dummett describe it in more depth than I'm going to, and then say, "This summary has passed over many further details, and it is evident that this whole tortuous system of correspondences is completely arbitrary. It is not derived from the tarot, but imposed on it. No one wishing to devise a pack of cards exhibiting a double correspondence with the letters of the divine name, or with the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, would hit on one with the structure of the tarot pack." In 1896, the Egyptian tarot got another makeover from an actor named R. Falconier in Les 22 Lames Hermétiques du Tarot Divinatoire. He renamed many of the major arcana and switched them up a bit to fit the Orientalist theme better. 13 years after Falconier, Popess published yet another book on tarot called Le Tarot Divinatoire in 1909. It contains barely a hint of the arcane knowledge in Le Tarot des Bohémiens, focusing instead on cartomancy, which Popess still believed was a feminine predilection. It proclaims that the minor arcana is necessary to use the tarot as a divination tool correctly. As such, it doesn't use Worth's illustrations, since those are limited to the 22 major arcana. Instead, Gabriel Goulenat, an artist from the École des Beaux-Arts, illustrates the 78 lames of the Egyptian tarot printed in the back of the book. The book itself, Decker, DePoli, and Dummett regard with open disdain, saying, "It is obvious that Le Tarot Divinatoire was thrown together by Popess in the greatest haste and with the least possible trouble." They cite copy-pasted text from Le Tarot Bohémien, huge chunks of raw quotation from other writers, including Ataya, and an elaborate mislabeling of what he calls Tarot Indien, which are, in fact, 5 of 10 illustrations of incarnations of Vishnu, apparently found in Levy's private collection and included on the basis that Popess thought it appropriate. Neither Falconier nor Popess's books accompany decks themselves, as we've now come to expect. Instead, the readers were instructed to cut illustrations out and paste them onto cardboard in order to make the decks themselves. This strikes me as really odd. Why not mass-produce them? Does that subtract from the secret occult nature they were trying to imbue the cards with? If so, why publish these books to the public at all? I don't have much fondness for tarot as a smorgasbord of different esoteric meanings from Kabbalah, Hermeticism, astrology, numerology, and Egyptology. I think the bundling of imagery and meaning can be really deeply fruitful if you are well versed in what each element represents. You get kind of a cross-section of a bunch of different ideas, narrowed by association with each other into a single shape peculiar to that intersection. So I can kind of see the deeper insight an occultist might have had to a tarot card, given their training in those fields, but I find much of the early association of those specific elements with tarot to be arbitrary and coincidental at best, and shoehorned, appropriative, and orientalist at worst. I mean, to some extent, most doctrine and myth is just some stuff someone said once that resonated with people to some degree, but this is just taking a handful of Frenchmen at their word when the depth of their associations is just that they decided it was true. When I encounter so many of these systems of meaning, I find myself asking, who says? Who defines the number 3 as representing growth? That question turns out to be incredibly difficult to answer, since authors in the occult have a tendency to mash things together, repeat things word for word, and make up things whole cloth when constructing their manuscripts. A single definitive source for any given concept is hard to find. But with the Rider-Waite Tarot, we know who says: A.E. Waite and Pamela Colman Smith, both members of the Golden Dawn. Well, why did they say the things they said? Because of what they were inundated with in the Golden Dawn. Why was the Golden Dawn fixated on the things it was studying? What was at the heart of its hypothesis? What was it trying to prove? How is A.E. Waite and Pamela Colman Smith's work an extension of that hypothesis? Which brings us at last to 1909, the year that the Rider-Waite deck was published by William Rider and Son of London, with a key to the tarot written by A.E. Waite, the first iteration of the guidebook included with the deck in the package U.S. game system sells today. Arthur Edward Waite was born in New York in 1857, and raised in England by his mother after his father died at sea. His Catholic faith was shaken when his sister died in 1874, and he began investigating the esoteric at 21. Dummett and Decker write of Waite that he cannot be described as a magician, but he was an occultist. His aim was, by the use of occult symbolism and ceremony, to create a substitute for religion, perhaps for that religion which he had practiced so enthusiastically in his boyhood. According to Wikipedia, Waite joined the Outer Order of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1891 after being introduced by E. W. Berridge, a medical doctor in London. Waite's passages in and out again of the Golden Dawn and Rosy Cross and all its various splinter societies over the course of the next 24 years is the tiniest peek into the clash of personalities that came to characterize the order. For we petty creatures who love hot mess, the Golden Dawn is a treasure. But, for the purposes of this essay, we must focus on what Waite learned from the order, and what inspired him to take what he learned into refitting and publishing the tarot that we know today. We have some of his own language on the subject in The Key to the Tarot itself, published alongside the tarot deck. There is a secret tradition concerning the tarot, as well as a secret doctrine contained therein. I have followed some part of it without exceeding the limits which are drawn about matters of this kind and belong to the laws of honor. This tradition has two parts, and as one of them has passed into writing, it seems to follow that it may be betrayed at any moment, which will not signify because the second has not so passed at present, and is held by very few indeed. I ask, therefore, to be distinguished from a few writers in recent times who have thought fit to hint that they could say a good deal more if they liked, for we do not speak the same language. But also from anyone who may say that she or he will tell all, because they have only the accidents and not the essentials necessary for such disclosure. I have said as much as I can. It is the truth, after its own manner, and as much as can be expected or required in those outer circles where the qualifications of special research cannot be expected. This seems to be how he can indulge the holdings his ego has about mastery of the esoteric and oaths of secrecy taken about said esoterica, while also correcting errors he saw in the iterations of tarot presented in the Golden Dawn and in circulation by other occultists. But let's back up a tad. Before he published the deck with Ryder, Waite translated Levy's work from French to English and drew a great deal from Levy's tarot when designing his own deck. But he was not beholden to it, moving around several cards and dropping some meanings while emphasizing others. According to Robert M. Place, Waite has consistently said that the trumps in the tarot do not relate to the Hebrew letters, and he included details in the layout of his deck that would contradict both Levy's and the Golden Dawn's associations. But he does appear to have approved with the Golden Dawn's celestial and elemental associations, which can be clearly seen on at least 2/3 of the trumps. Waite was aware of Kabbalah enough to attempt scholarship on it himself, though it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. On the blog post The Jewish History of Tarot, JewWitches.com quotes Gershom Scholem, an influential Jewish scholar and author, as criticizing A.E. Waite's books on Kabbalah. Even though Waite's sense of historical criticism may have been superior to that of other contemporary esoteric writers on Kabbalah, it still remained extremely inadequate. Waite appeared to be ignorant of almost all of the modern literature on Kabbalah, so that what he wrote about its origins, development, and decline was, for 80%, wholly without foundation. Although Waite claimed to have searched hard for manuscripts, he was blissfully unaware of the relevant holdings even in the British Museum, not to mention manuscripts in Oxford, Munich, and so on. It is only with sincere regret about the fatal disproportion between Waite's great labours and the depths of understanding that was possible for him on the one hand, and his so sadly deficient knowledge of original sources and a useful historical critical foundation on the other hand, that one will have to put this book aside. This raises the question, is the Rider-Waite deck valuable at all to actual practitioners of Kabbalah? According to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Judaism does recognize astrology, ancient wisdom through which you can predict the future and/or determine certain things about people. However, consulting the future is forbidden. While astrology may give you insight on your weaknesses, strengths, character traits, and so on, it does not tell you anything specific about your future. Lots of secular sources I've found like to talk about how the major arcana has been tweaked to suit the tree of life, but given Waite's refusal to use actual sources, I imagine he could only luck into accuracy, speaking with a vocabulary and grammar he did not understand. Meanwhile, Rosicrucian iconography and Christian mysticism saturate the deck. It cannot be stressed enough how much Jewish mysticism was filtered through an overwhelmingly Catholic lens. Gabelin, de Maillet, Levy, Christian, Waite, all of them began, and some continued their spiritual journey, with Catholicism, and pulled those biases forward with them into the occult, whether they meant to or not. Okay, then what esoterica was the Golden Dawn supplying for Waite? Joseph Gurney describes in the Tarot of the Golden Dawn, one of the most important Inner Order documents is the so-called Book T. This contains a full description of the divinatory meanings of the tarot trumps and the minor arcana. It also gives a method of attributing the minor arcana to the various decans of the zodiac, of which is said, "Next unto the Bible it is our greatest treasure, which ought to be delivered to the censure of the world." Gurney goes on to describe how the Golden Dawn squirmed astrology around to suit the major arcana as they understood it. You can pause and read this if you've got a head for astrological terms and whatnot. I think even if I were well versed in astrology, it would give me a headache to describe the differences of their methodologies from Levi and Popess and fucking commonly accepted astrology. The gist of it is, Book T moved some of the major arcana cards around to match Kabbalah because they happen to share numbers, wedged astrology in there, and then filled out the gaps with the minor arcana. Dummett and Decker write, Mathers, co-founder of the Golden Dawn, thought that he had been shown how absolutely correct the symbolism of the Book T is, and how exactly it represents the occult forces of the universe. The truth is, with his theory as with other detailed interpretations of the tarot in terms of a mixture of the Kabbalah with astrology, that it has been made to fit only by force majeure. The natural way to represent the decans, like the signs of the zodiac, is pictorially, like the personifications on the frescoes of the Palazzo di Schifonoia in Ferrara. No one wishing to depict them would reasonably think of doing so by means of collocations of 4 suit symbols, repeated from 2 to 10 times, even without adding aces and court cards using the same suit symbols but with a different significance. The primal mistake was to attempt an occult interpretation of the suit cards at all. Insofar as they represent anything, it is not the occult forces of the universe, but the heraldic emblems of the court of Mamluk Egypt, the source of the oldest known examples of the suit symbols. Here's an interesting bit of context-sensitive design from Gurney, though. A point of divergence between the Golden Dawn tarot and other tarot decks is that, rather than having upright and reversed meanings, the cards are either said to be well-dignified or ill-dignified. The Golden Dawn makes use of tarot spreads in which the meanings of the individual cards are judged according to the influence of other cards, which are in close proximity. Hence, a card which is surrounded by other cards of generally harmonious nature is said to be well-dignified, whilst one that is surrounded by inharmonious cards is ill-dignified. The precise meaning of a card may also be more specifically attenuated by the surrounding cards. So, for example, the 5 of Pentacles may mean either financial loss or marital problems. Were this card surrounded by cards of the suit of Pentacles, this would emphasize the financial or material loss aspects of the card. If, on the other hand, it were surrounded by cups, this might indicate that an interpretation concerning marital or relationship problems might be better emphasized. If surrounded by wands, this might indicate problems with an enterprise in which one is engaged, such as one's career. Swords, on the other hand, might point to the fact that problems are caused by strife or conflict with another person. In the last mentioned example, the precise meaning might differ tremendously depending on which particular card it actually was. If the 5 of Pentacles were next to the 2 of Swords, for example, this might indicate the possibility that the problems could be resolved. If, however, it were the 10 of Swords, this would indicate the opposite, that these problems would lead to disaster. This knowledge was kept secret on pain of oath for years, until Aleister Crowley published Liber 777 in his periodical The Equinox in 1909. Liber 777 contained everything Crowley had been able to get his hands on of the Golden Dawn's secret rituals, rites, and esoterica. I don't know what month Liber 777 was published, but the writer Waite came out at the end of 1909. Did Waite suspect this was coming? Was it in direct reaction to Liber 777 spilling the beans? Was Waite trying to control some portion of the narrative around occult sciences now that Crowley had claimed a public spotlight? Or was the tarot pack as a public commodity a longer game that Waite was finally capitalizing on? At this point, Waite had a fairly full catalog of published esoteric writing under his belt, and a relationship with Writer as a publisher. He also wrote a number of books and articles under the pseudonym Grand Orient, and most of his texts had at least footnotes telling readers to petition Writer for the tarot deck and guide they coincidentally had for sale. Decker and Dummett write, in December 1909, Waite published a short essay, The Tarot, A Wheel of Fortune, in the Occult Review, to publicize the imminent publication of the pack designed by Pamela Colman Smith. Misspelling her name, he announces that he has interested a very skillful and original artist, Miss Pamela Colman Smith, in the proposal to design a set and thereby to rectify the symbolism. In this, he says, we have had other help from one who is deeply versed on the subject. He twice refers to the Manual of Cartomancy, written by Grant Orient, and declares that the secret doctrine embodied in the tarot is of all ages and peoples. So we know that the Rider-Waite publication was cushioned on either side by Waite's actual bibliography, and propped up by the work under a pseudonym. Decker and Dummett give us this picture of A.E. Waite as an author and occultist. His writing often creates the illusion of the work of a fastidious scholar repelled by the grandiose and irrational pretenses of occultism. It is an illusion, however. Waite, a member of the Golden Dawn and leader of one of the fragments into which it broke, was as committed to occultism as any of those whom he so scornfully rebuked. The outcome of reading him is thus a double vision. He explains clearly why, in purely factual respects, the beliefs of the occultists are unfounded, but one is left to gather that to reject the inner core of those beliefs is to be guilty of superficiality and disrespect for a profound tradition. For A.E. Waite, the Rider-Waite Tarot was a culmination of his occult knowledge. But, as K. Frank Jensen writes for the playing card, however much we dislike the idea, we probably have to acknowledge that to Pamela Colman Smith, the 78 tarot cards were a commissioned work, which she worked on during a relatively short period only in 1909, at the same time when she was occupied with several other projects, including an exhibition in New York and involvement with the suffrage movement. In Queen of Wands, Kat Willett portrays Pamela Colman Smith as vivacious and hardworking, but ultimately overlooked. Smith was born in England in 1878 to American and Jamaican parents, and grew up in England and New York. She trained under Arthur Wesley Dow at the Pratt Institute when she was 15, though ultimately dropped out of school to take care of her dying mother in Jamaica. Then, shortly after Smith moved to England, her father died, leaving her an orphan at 21. Pixie to her friends, Smith was inundated with the arts, friends with Dracula's author Bram Stoker, then famous actor Henry Irving, and poet W.B. Yeats, among others. Yeats was the one who invited her to join the Golden Dawn, which was one of the few secret societies to accept women in their ranks. Smith was also involved in the suffragette movement, and we understand that she was good friends with known lesbian Edie Craig for a number of years. We don't know anything for sure, but she was also roommates with lifelong friend Nora Lake for 40 years until the end of her life. So, who can say? Smith had some success with gallery showings, including one that showcased her synesthesia by painting pieces by Debussy, who said, "You have not only captured the idea which was in my mind, but you have carried it further." But when she tried her hand publishing her own periodicals under the title The Green Sheaf, featuring predominantly women artists and writers, she found little success. Waite approached Smith about the deck in 1909. I don't suspect that their working relationship was the closest, given that Waite said of Smith, "I had to spoon-feed her my orders," and Smith wrote to a friend at the end of the project only that, "I've just finished a big job for very little cash." This small pittance would be the only money she would ever see from the project. She finished the 78 illustrations in 6 months, which is an impressive turnaround considering how iconic and densely designed the cards are. And I mean iconic in both senses of singular and genre-defining and full of iconography. Afterwards, she went on to publish many books, magazines, and paintings, living on the meager wages of a work-for-hire illustrator in England. To her, this deck was one of many projects thrown out into the void. We don't even have her originals anymore. Yet millions of copies of the Rider-Waite Tarot have been sold all over the world. That financial support would have made a real difference had she been able to keep the rights to her art. Without that, she struggled to make ends meet for the rest of her life. In an effort to better honor her enormous contribution, some folks have taken to calling it the Smith or Smith-Waite deck, which I'll do for the remainder of the video. Smith and Waite had the benefit of access to a comprehensive understanding of functioning systems of meaning, like astrology, within the Golden Dawn and its ensuing splinters. I'm not saying astrology is true, I'm saying it's coherent and self-supporting and was refined over a very, very, very long time. Why do the Lovers and the Devil mirror each other? Astrologically, the Lovers is linked to Gemini, and the Devil is linked to Capricorn, which are opposites. Is the change from Cupid firing at a man, making a choice between two women, to two figures overlooked by an angel a design choice in order to support this mirroring? I'd argue, yeah, it's very intentional. The visual vocabulary of the Smith-Waite deck is limited, repeated across the deck, iterated and subverted and rephrased as needed. It's part of what holds the whole thing together. Sometimes this is based on iconography that predates Smith and Waite. Often it's invented or tweaked for this deck in particular. The antiquated trappings of the deck can be attributed in part to the Solabusca tarot and in part to A.E. Waite's interest in Arthurian legend and Celtic myth. Farley notes, as with W.B. Yeats, Waite came to see the correspondences between the tarot suits and the Grail hollows or talismans of Celtic myth, which he named as the lance, the dish, the grail, and the sword. he erroneously traced the legends of King Arthur and the Holy Grail back to earlier Celtic mythology. What's interesting is, though the deck is designed to be unfruitful at conversation with itself, Smith's designs do not always align with Waite's proposed vision. Place notes, although Smith dropped the symbol of Mercury and kept the goat head linking her figure to Capricorn, Waite wrote in his description of the picture in the pictorial key that at the pit of the stomach there is a sign of Mercury, which is true of Eliphas Levy's double, not of Smith's. Waite supplied very specific instructions for the major arcana, but left the minor arcana well enough alone, providing only a simple list of meanings, so the scenes that are present there are of Smith's making. It's hard to say how much of the discrepancies between Smith and Waite are to do with disagreements Smith may have had with Waite's vision, or simple errors in the rush to design and illustrate 78 cards in 6 months. A big job for very little cash. I wish that attitude towards artists had died before Smith's time, but alas. Is the secret to the Smith-Waite's popularity just capitalism? Worth's 22-card deck at least had Grimaud's publication prowess behind it, but Popess's and Falconier's decks required a physical butchering of their books and concentrated effort to paste them onto cardboard backing. People will do that, as print and plague decks will attest, but it's a lot of work, so only folks who are already completely bought into the idea will have those decks. Whereas the Smith-Waite is the full package, deck and explanations bundled into one. It's just better product design. But Ateya had also sold decks and instructions in walking distance from each other, as had Grimaud in publishing the Petit Lenormand decks. Was it better marketing? A more receptive public? What makes Smith-Waite stand the test of time? Imagine, for a moment, that I've picked you up by the scruff, wheeled you around, and dropped you in London circa 1910. Do you know where you would go to get a tarot deck? My guess would be, okay, maybe start with a toy store for the Tarot de Marseille. That's probably popular enough to be in England. Would Lenormand or a Princess deck make it across the channel, or would you have to import that special from France? For that matter, would Lenormand or Princess be too self-serious for a toy shop? The Cabalistique and Tarot Divinatoire sure as hell would be. We're looking for something divinatory, something to rival the Smith-Waite. Remember, the Solabusca is only available as photographs at the British Museum. We want something to take home. Right. Other than secret societies, where do you get spiritualist and occult paraphernalia? Where are Waite and Worth and Popess publishing their manuscripts? There are magazines at this point. Waite published a teaser in the Occult Review, so let's try a bookstore or a newsstand. Maybe they can put us in the right direction. Worth only published 350 decks of the Cabalistique, so I don't know if we'll get lucky. Does Ryder & Son have a storefront? Worst comes to worst, Waite encouraged us to write in for a copy. Well, if we jump the pond and wait 6 years, it'll be pirated in America in 1916, and Smith's illustrations will be reproduced in countless books on tarot forevermore. Crowley's own Book of Thoth was published in the 1960s and enjoyed some success, but even today it's the Smith-Waite deck that you recognize. The truth is, at least in those early days, the Smith-Waite didn't have much in the way of competition. A lot of the divinatory decks contemporary with the Smith-Waite are either handmade, extremely limited run, or just playing card decks like tarot is originally. By the time Marteau repackaged the Marseille deck as a fortune-telling pack, Smith-Waite had been the standard for a good, 20 years? Tarot's market has never been that big to begin with, so it's easy for one deck to dominate. Before he founded US Game Systems, Inc., Stuart Kaplan surprised the vendors at an A.G. Mueller & Cy stall by ordering 5,000 of their tarot decks for export to the US, more than Mueller generally expected to sell in a year. He went on to acquire the rights to the Smith-Waite deck from Ryder directly, and history has proved him right too. Smith's illustrations, as arcane as their meanings might be, are as accessible as the deck has ever been for divination. The name of the game, in design, marketing, and even pirated propagation, is accessibility. All of this is not to say that the Smith-Waite deck is a perfectly self-referential iconographic system. I don't know the deck well enough to proclaim that as a fact, and it seems unlikely since it's still kitbashing several different traditions of meaning systems together. There's bound to be some friction. But the Smith-Waite deck has the benefit of its predecessor's successes and failures, and the Golden Dawn, as much as it was a messy social club with lots of clashing personalities, was a repository of exactly the symbolism that Waite and Smith are drawing from. The tarot itself, its iconographic origin still a mystery, astrology, alchemy, hermeticism, and yes, Kabbalah. As much as Waite might protest its presence, he himself references it often in Keys to the Tarot. But if all of that is true, and I'm not trained in the occult sciences, then by definition, when I pick up a tarot deck, I'm playing with something I don't understand. Isn't that ignorant at best, and at worst the same as appropriation? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. The Golden Dawn was a secret society, yes, but Smith and Waite were two of many members who published their works often and were hoping for commercial success. Systems like astrology have swaths of information that is freely available, and that its experts want you to have. Whether or not Kabbalah counts as one of these open systems is unclear, since it arises from but is not the same as Judaism, which is a closed religion, and has been looted, syncretized, and appropriated so much over time that clear consent is hard for me to recognize. I err on the side of caution, and I don't engage with that system. I'm capable of leaving it be because Kabbalah's association with tarot is, as Gershom Scholem notes with dismay, woefully uninformed and inaccurate, and based solely on the strength of Eliphas Levi's word. And people were reading tarot cards before he came around. There is a lot to the deck in its base iconography. While there are modern decks that embrace Jewish mysticism with more accuracy and grace, the Smith-Waite is as close to Kabbalah as the Princess deck is to ancient Egypt. The Smith-Waite, like the divinatory decks that preceded it, is a symbolic object. The point of a symbol is that it evokes association in the viewer's eyes, and a universal symbol is made specific by its viewer. You get as much out of a system of meaning as you put in. Not every association is valid, in my opinion. The kind of parallels that Pollock drew with the Hanged Man veer dangerously close to simply drawing parallels between cultural archetypes that greatly simplify, ignore, or outright erase the context in which those archetypes exist in their respective home cultures, for the sake of supporting the theory of a single syncretic monomyth. The Venn diagram of St. Peter and Odin contains a single point of overlap: religious figure upside down. Their purpose, cultural position, goals, and outcome are all vastly different. Forcing the circles to overlap further robs each mythology of a wealth of understanding, complexity, and nuance that syncretism supposedly supports. However, I think having access to that network of meaning is valuable. Tarot is a tool that encourages the reader to project order, reason, logic, and insight onto random juxtaposition. In that pursuit, having a wide variety of perspectives from which to view a given symbol is really useful. That's not to say I think a card should be able to mean anything. You still need limitation and focus to foster creativity and clarity. However, if you know why a given symbol means something different to another person, you might come to understand their worldview a little better, and challenge your own comprehension along the way. And you can use that same symbol in a different way in your storytelling. For example, if you're drawing the Hanged Man for an alchemist, who would see hanging upside down as a way to get wisdom out of their semen and into their brain juice, you might set the traitor's interpretation aside in favor of a well-meaning but misguided act of desperation. In this way, you're using a breadth of information to develop a narrow interpretation specific to this particular context. New Age sensibilities brought a shift in the occult from the universal to the personal, from the psychic to the psychological. By the time tabletop games found their footing in the 20th century, tarot's purpose and cultural footprint had shifted once again. But that's for another video. Today, I'll leave you with Pamela Coleman Smith's art and A.E. Waite's guidance. It should be noted, 1, that the tree of sacrifice is living wood, with leaves thereon. 2, that the face expresses deep entrancement, not suffering. 3, that the figure as a whole suggests life in suspension, but life and not death. It is a card of profound significance, but all the significance is veiled. One of his editors suggested that Eliphas Levi did not know the meaning, which is unquestionable, nor did the editor himself. It has been called falsely a card of martyrdom, a card of prudence, a card of the great work, a card of duty. But we may exhaust all published interpretations and find only vanity. I will say very simply on my own part that it expresses the relation in one of its aspects between the divine and the universe. He who can understand that the story of his higher nature is embedded in this symbolism will receive intimations concerning a great awakening that is possible, and will know that after the sacred mystery of death, there is a glorious mystery of resurrection.